One thing I really want you to be aware of is I want you to see when you watch maybe a professional violinist versus an amateur or school violinist, the difference in the ability to make and create sound. Like when I sit in the Philadelphia Orchestra, the amazing amount of dynamic range that we have compared to your average sort of high school orchestra is ridiculous. It's so evident when I have, like I say, if I'm doing a sectional and I'm doing a master class or something with a section of violinists, and hearing them play, their louds are not anywhere near as loud and their softs aren't nearly as soft. So this is something that, like I say, you have to start to build up an awareness of. Number one, I think those two extremes are something to actually work on and be very, very sort of diligent and try and see how softly you can play at times and how loud you could play at times. Sustain loud and sustain softs. So let me explain something. Playing loud, let's start there. That's pretty loud. It hurts my ear almost. You know, I practice at a very loud, with a very loud sound. So loud that sometimes, like I say, if people are doing other tasks, they can't hear me or they can't talk to me because they can't talk over my violin. I've learned to do that. That's a learned skill, to sustain long tones like that at a very, 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 loud volume. And what I'm doing when I do that is I'm really pulling sound with a great amount of, energy, that being with lots of weight and the right speed, making the violin resonate and maintaining it. It's not just one note where I've accent and let go. You can hear that sort of giant accent. Now, sometimes we want that, but when we're trying to play a phrase and we're playing, like for example, something, especially up high or that kind of sound takes a lot of energy. It takes a lot of work. But the kind of work I mean is just work whereby we are very sort of engaged, our brain's engaged, that we're making sound, that we're not letting go, of that intensity and that vigorous sort of energy whereby I'm putting lots of consistent weight, lots of consistent speed, making the sound sort of spin. That's kind of how I would describe it. There's like a spinning nature to this. It's like having a top spin. You keep making it spin and don't want it to sort of, all of a sudden wither and then kind of come to a halt. It's a constant feeling that I'm putting energy into that sound, making it spin. Conversely, how do we make the sound very, very soft? There are times in the orchestra that I will play literally the most softest thing you could ever imagine, because when there's 16 of us in one section and there's 14 in another section, that's 30 violins. And you may have one violin soloist or one other soloist in another sort of instrument. They need to dominate. And if I play like this, I'm going to be pretty close to their sound, quite honestly, at a certain dynamic. So if I played at this dynamic while everyone else was doing this, I would so greatly stick out, it would be kind of ridiculous. People would probably look at me like I was not right. So, and it would be kind of humorous. I would never do it, of course, unless I was trying to joke around or mess around. But that being said, learning how to move the bow in a way that is so controlled, I almost feel as if I'm playing with one hair of the bow hair. I have the bow tilted super far away from me. I'm playing really, really close to the fingerboard with almost barely any weight and barely any speed. That being said, you can practice playing, something of a mezzo forte or mezzo piano down to something near zero. So for example, and make that sort of disappear without the, friendly acoustics. It's a challenge. It's something that you need to work on, especially when you're ending a phrase. If I'm playing the end of, like, for example, end of a Beethoven, or end of a Bach. I really want to make that sound disappear as if you were closing the door, or you could sense that I was walking away, and that it's just sort of a distant. There's a sort of feeling of distance. It takes skill. It's not something that happens automatically. all too often, I see students just end, and they sort of just, they kind of put a muffle on the violin as if, and they're done. There's such a hastiness to the way they end a phrase or end a note. There's no cadence, there's no real ending and tapering of the note. Tapering and making that kind of effect with your bow is a critical thing to learn so as to be able to learn how to phrase. It takes a lot of bow control. It takes a lot of bow control, period, to play loud or soft or sustain those dynamics or, like I say, make crescendos or diminuendos. When we want to make a diminuendo, I just described what I'm doing. If I want to make a crescendo, I'll start with a very slow bow speed. Increase the weight and increase the speed. And you can hear how all of a sudden it starts to get really loud. It's basically, it's just like I've said in the past, what makes the bow make sound? Speed, weight, point of contact. Figuring out how to use those variables basically dictates how we make those different kinds of dynamics. Lastly, let me just kind of say a couple things about certain dynamics like sforzandos. All too often, your average student does not understand how to make a forzando. A lot of times they do it sort of aggressively in a way that's kind of overly blunt and kind of reckless, I would say, where they make a harsh accent or they do something very sort of, like I said, aggressive. I don't think it's necessarily very musical and very appropriate when especially if you're playing, a Beethoven symphony. Yes, sometimes you want that, but sometimes you just want a very full sort of sforzando whereby you hear this yum, and it's done kind of primarily with both hands. Or you can vibrate a little bit to accentuate and make a sort of, like I say, a accent. However, it's not an accent that's done sort of percussively. It's more sort of rounded. If you're doing a tremolo, lots of times in the orchestra, my colleagues, we make accents or we make forzandos more with bow speed and lots of bow, rather than just going with a sort of acute attack. That's sort of, like I say, that's kind of very simple, overly simple. It has to have a certain musical feel and a certain sort of roundedness that you have to learn. It takes a little bit of experience, and you'll see orchestra musicians, or you see, like in a Mahler symphony, everybody really use a tremendous amount of bow, a lot of energy, a lot of momentum, and a lot of, like I say, pushing the sound outward. So those are just different things. If you have any questions as far as how to get better in your dynamic range, send me a video or whatever you need to do. But I really want to know that you're really thinking about these things, and that when you play things, that you kind of have an awareness of the dynamics and reading them and then trying to literally perform them and do it with as much range. The more range, the more colorful and the more interesting your playing will be.